is honored to have Dr. Gregory Feist with us today, who will shed light on the age-old question. On the age-old question, is creativity somehow connected to mental disorders? So when we heard he was going to be in town, we were delighted to have him come to Moraine. He was open, so we're thankful for that, and to speak to our students. Dr. Gregory Feist is a professor of psychology in personality and adult development at San Jose State University. He's also taught at the College of William and Mary and the University of California, Davis. He received his doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley, and his undergraduate degree from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Dr. Feist is widely published in the psychology of creativity, the psychology of science, and the development of scientific talent. One of his major goals is establishing the psychology of science as a healthy and independent study of science along the lines of history, philosophy, and sociology of science. Toward this end, Dr. Feist has published a book titled Psychology of Science and the Origins of the Scientific Mind, which was awarded the 2007 William James Book Prize by the American Psychological Association's Division of General Psychology. In addition, he's the founding president of the International Society for the Psychology of Science and Technology. A second major focus for Dr. Feist is the identification and development of scientific talent, as seen in finalists of the Westinghouse and Intel Science Talent Search. His paper, which was co-authored with Frank Barron, which is called Predicting Creativity from Early to Late Adulthood, Intellect, Potential, and Personality, won Article of the Year in 2003 in the Journal of Research and Personality and Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity in the Arts. His teaching efforts have been recognized by outstanding teaching awards at both UC Berkeley and UC Davis. Dr. Feist is also an author for McGraw-Hill. He has co-authored the undergraduate textbook Psychology, Theories of Personalities, which we use on this campus, with his father, Jess Feist, and Tommy Ann Roberts. In his spare time, Dr. Feist enjoys spending time cycling, skiing, and with his sons, Jerry and Evan. So join me in welcoming Dr. Gregory Feist.
Thanks. Didn't realize my kids were going to get a shout out here. I'll have to tell them. They'll be excited. Thank you. Thank you. This is actually an honor and a pleasure to be here. Even though I'm from Northern California, I actually was born in Kansas, so I'm a little bit familiar with the Midwest, although it's been a while. So, yeah, although I'm not quite used to the cold wind. That's something that takes a little getting used to. So, yeah, so today my talk, as you can see and know, it's really one of the age-old questions. Is there a connection between mental illness and world-class creativity? So just to give you a sense, you know, hopefully you're familiar with all these people, from William Shakespeare to Virginia Woolf to Da Vinci to Newton, Einstein, Curie, Bach, Beethoven, Van Gogh, and Picasso. These are obviously extreme cases of genius, okay? And by the way, one thing that I just want to point out, and we'll talk about this, is there is a connection between genius and creativity, but they're not the same thing. You know, you can be, it takes a special kind of creativity to be a genius. And these people are all that. They've changed the world. But the question of madness, as it's historically been called, and genius, really was first brought up by good old Aristotle, possibly Seneca, but most people attribute it to Aristotle. And this was the quote: "There's no real genius without some touch of madness." So the idea is that if you're really, really creative and at a genius level, you're also going to be a little bit off. And maybe those two things are somehow, it's not a coincidence, that they might even be causally related. Not to say that all mad people, as they used the word back then more generically, were genius, of course, but if you were a genius, you probably had this. At least that's the question. Then one of my intellectual heroes, the guy that I wrote a paper with that we just talked about, Frank Barron, actually I love this quote. This is one of my favorite quotes because it really is a balanced view. He says, "Thus the creative genius may be at once naive and knowledgeable, being at home equally in primitive symbolism and to rigorous logic. He's both more primitive and more cultured, more destructive and more constructive. Occasionally crazier," this is the real phrase, "occasionally crazier and yet adamantly saner than the average person." So what Barron is saying is that the really creative person is both. They have this, as he called it, ego strength to go into the depths of these kind of wild, crazy ideas, but then they have the ego strength to come out of that, okay, and do something creative and constructive with it, which takes a real skill. And then another major figure in the field right now, Dean Simonton, said this about the connection. He's actually arguing for a different view. He says few creative individuals can be considered truly mentally ill. Indeed, outright disorder usually inhibits rather than helps creative expression. Furthermore, a large portion of creators exhibit no symptoms, at least not to any measurable degree. And actually, that's another important point, that if you're really mentally disturbed, you're probably not going to be creative because, by definition, mental illness at that level is dysfunctional. And dysfunctional means it interferes with everyday functioning. So there's probably some sweet spot is kind of what Simonton is suggesting too. And that's really one of the questions. I'm going to give you two quotes. One from a world-class creative person and one from a mentally ill person. And I'm going to see if you can tell me which is which quote. Here's the first quote. They're also different. Boylan talking about the shape of my foot, and he noticed that once, even before he was introduced when I was in the DBC with Poldy laughing and trying to listen, I was waggling my foot. We both ordered 2 teas of plain bread and butter, and I saw him looking with 2 old maids of sisters. When I stood up and asked the girl where it was, what do I care with it dropping out of me in that black clothes breeches he made me buy? Takes you half an hour to let down, wetting all myself, always with some brand new fad every other week. Got it? Make sense? Okay. Now, is that from a crazy person, or is this one? This creation in which we live began with the dominant nature as an identification body of a completed evolutionary strong material creation in which a major body resistance force, and is fulfilling the nature identification in a like weaker material identification creation in which 2 major bodies have already fulfilled radio body balances and embodying the third material identification embodiment of both. Which one was the world-class creative, written by the world-class creative person? And why do you say that?
Because it seems like an acid question.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Right. They're both, I think it's fair to say, they're both equally kind of what? Huh? You know, they, at least on the surface, don't really make a whole lot of sense. As it turns out, yes, the first quote is from James Joyce's Ulysses. And have you at least heard of that? You know, it was actually deemed the most creative and important work of English literature of the 20th century. And so what James Joyce was doing, he was actually influenced by Freud, actually. And James Joyce in Ulysses decided to make the internal workings of a person's mind the thrust of Ulysses. So that's a kind of a stream of consciousness. And notice there was no grammar, you know, or anything. But if you really paid attention to your own thinking, that's what it would be like. It would just be this run-on sentences, not grammatical, not logical, not really rational. And that's what our minds are like. And that's what Joyce was so creative, because he was the first writer to make that the material of literature. This, on the other hand, is written by someone who is schizophrenic, diagnosable with schizophrenia, and it's called word salad. I don't know if any of you have taken abnormal psych yet. But word salad is when you speak in a way that's kind of like when you toss a salad. Okay, you're tossing a salad, and you're just kind of throwing words together. I mean, all of these words individually make sense, and they almost make sense in a sentence, but they really don't. They're just kind of thrown together. Okay, so this is actually a schizophrenic person, and the first one was a world-class creative person. And so one of the points here is, what is creativity? I don't know if you probably can't see this, especially in the back, but this is a recent cartoon. It says, I'm going to cut my hair. Super innovative, right? And the box then says, it's not always healthy to think outside the box, okay, which is one of the key phrases for being creative. Let's just think outside the box. Let's just be different to be different. Well, this makes it clear that creativity is not just difference. It's just not originality. Because actually those 2 quotes also, they were equally original. Neither one of them were ever thought before, probably. They were completely original, and yet one is deemed creative and one isn't. And the reason one is creative is because creativity involves both originality and novelty. Yes, that's, you know, when I ask students, what makes someone creative? They always say original and different. And then I say, well, but that's not quite enough. You know, putting your hair in a blender, cutting your hair in a blender, which is what she's doing, is really original. It's not really creative, though, okay? Because it's not meaningful or adaptive or useful. So when we talk about creativity, it really needs to be both. And so the second criterion for creativity is that it has to have social meaning to other people. You know, Van Gogh, for instance, wasn't deemed creative in his life because people didn't understand what he was doing. It was a little bit ahead of its time, but then soon after he died, actually, people started to appreciate Van Gogh's paintings, and they became really quite influential. But they had meaning. But during his life, they didn't really have meaning to other people. So creativity is ultimately a social evaluation. So when we talk about literary, music, or science forms that are really creative, what they're doing is they're creating new branches of music or literature or art. So they're meaningful to other people in that way. Okay. So that's just a little bit of a backdrop as to what I mean by creative. And so when I talk about creative genius, I'm talking about people who are creating both original and very meaningful works of art or scientific findings or ideas. Okay. This is depressing. 46% is the rate in the U.S. population of some kind of mental disorder at some point in their life. Okay, so 46% of us will have a diagnosable disorder at some point in our adult life, according to this research. This is Kessler. It's now 10 years old, but it's actually, this is a big study. It actually hasn't changed too much right now. By the way, well, on the one hand, that means 56% of us aren't, but also notice that people who do have a disorder are likely to have more than one disorder. By the way, the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for diagnosing mental disorders in the U.S. especially, has over 300 disorders. So, for instance, alcoholism is a disorder. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety disorders, phobias, mood disorders like depression, bipolar, personality disorders, narcissism, paranoia, and so on and so forth. So all of those count. So when we talk about 46%, we're just saying at least one disorder at some point in the adult life. And this is important in order to address this question of, is there a connection between mental illness and creativity? Because we have to know what the baseline is. We have to know what the rate in the general population is, and then compare our highly creative people to this number. Okay, that's really the crux of it. So back in the 90s, this guy, Arnold Ludwig, wrote a book called The Price of Greatness. And he did a major analysis of over 1,000 really creative people in 18 different professions. And we can group them into, in this case, 5 different groups of professions: the natural sciences, the social sciences, poetry, architecture, and art. And art, by the way, includes both visual art and music here. And then here's our base rate of 46% in the general population. And so what does this tell you? Is creativity related, according to this study, of over 1,000 famous people? By the way, these were based on biographies. These were famous creative people who had biographies written about them, and they analyzed the biography for the presence or absence of mental illness. And so what they found is, in poetry, these world-class creative poets, 87% of them had at least one mental illness, 87%. Okay, compared to the base rate of 46%. Whereas social science and architecture were roughly the base rate, not really much elevated. Natural sciences, so this is people like physicists and chemists and geologists. They're actually less likely to suffer mental illness. And then artists, musicians, and visual artists also seem to be a little bit elevated. So let me just ask you, just to make sure you're kind of here with me. What would your conclusion from this be? I'm going to pick on somebody else this time, although you had a very good answer last. Yeah. Ah. So you're already interpreting. Let's first describe, actually that's a good, you're kind of explaining maybe why there's this relationship. But let's first just be clear on what our general conclusion would be from these data, and then later on, and in fact I'm going to ask you that question, and let's come back to that, because actually you're really right on in terms of why. But that's a separate question. So if you had to write a summary description of this graph, what would the headline be? Okay, well.
Artists and poets are more likely to be depressed and alcoholic.
Well, not just depressed, or in any kind of disorder, right?
Yeah, but I feel like, I don't know, I'm just generalizing. I mean, the main ones for artists and poets.
Right. Well, right. It's quite clear that, so the question of, according to Ludwig, a question of the price of greatness. Who's paying for their greatness? Is everyone? Apparently not. It's really the artists and the poets. And yeah, the reason why is an interesting question, and we'll come back to that. So the reason I bring this up is because this study that one of my grad students and I are doing is we're going to replicate and extend this study. That's what we're doing right now. We're actually still in the middle of it. So we used Ludwig's findings as the basis of our own predictions and hypotheses. World-class creative artists will have elevated rates of lifetime mental wellness relative to world-class creative scientists and the general population. Okay. Get some water here. See, what I'm really interested in is also scientists, creative scientists, and I want to compare artists to scientists because to me that's an interesting comparison. So how did we? So this now I'm going to give you a little bit of background on this study that I'm doing. Again, we kind of replicated Ludwig, but did a little bit differently. We had people who had to be born either before 1980, or if they're still alive, and some of them are still alive, or they had to have died after 1950. Because we didn't want to do the same sample that Ludwig did, and Ludwig did people who died before 1950. And then we had to have, these are world-class people, so, and the reason we say that is because they have biographies written about them. You know, by definition, if you're an artist or a writer or a musician or a poet or whatever, and you have a biography written about you, that means you're pretty well known, obviously. That's the idea. What we also wanted is we wanted e-versions of these books. We wanted ideally Kindle versions so we could scan them and so on, but not all of them were in that format, so we then had to scan them ourselves. And then in terms to be even possibly in our study, there had to be a ranking of the most influential and creative, and we took the top 45 people across a bunch of different professions according to these rankings. These were like dictionaries of scientific biography, Britannica biographies of scientists, artifacts of the top 1,000 visual artists, Nobel Prize laureates, ranking of the top greatest novels, and so forth. So this is where we got our sample from, at least the initial sample. And then what we did is we had to get them, again, all in an electronic format, because we're trying to see what we're doing here is a biography had to be about the person's life, obviously. And so then we wanted to see whether the biographer said anything about them being alcoholic or depressive or schizophrenic or having anxiety disorders and so on and so forth. Because if they had those, the biographer would write about them. It was our assumption. Okay. All kinds of disorders like depression, mania, obsession, having hallucinations, suicide, PTSD, insomnia, anxious, impulsive. These are all standard disorders. Thanks. Okay, that we were coding for. And so then we have all these paragraphs throughout these books. Now, just because these words show up doesn't mean they're describing the person in question. They might be describing their parent or their child or their relative. So we had to make sure that those paragraphs were coded only if they were describing the creator themselves, not someone else. So we had to make sure of that. And then what we had to do is we had to take these paragraphs and have them coded blindly by undergraduate research assistants who don't know who these people were. We redacted, meaning we changed, every time their name showed up, it was changed by a computer to just say creator. So they didn't know who they were rating. We didn't want to bias them. They had to be blind to the identity of the creator. So we started with over 700 artists, scientists, and athletes. I forgot to say that our comparison, our base rate besides the general population, is famous or well-known athletes because they have biographies written about them too, but they're not creative. They're not artists or scientists or musicians or writers and so on. So we went from 766, but as it turns out, about half of them had no biographies written about them. They were in our ranking, so we couldn't study them. So we ended up with 375 potential participants. Right now, I'm trying to get to 250 altogether. We're not quite there, but so this is still going on. But we've purchased 188 of those biographies out of 375. We have 180 of them in this electronic format. And then we've selected and fully rated 161. So we're getting there of these paragraphs. So what we have is artists. We have about half of those 61 are artists. And by the way, for us, artists also includes, as you'll see here, actors. Okay, my little son's an actor, and I'm going to claim that actors, as actors, good actors, are artists, actually. Visual artists, fiction writers, poets, actors, musical performers, and musical composers. So 81, and then we have about 60 scientists. These are people in technology, people like Steve Jobs, other people who have changed the world. Computer science, mathematics, physics, chemistry, earth science, psychology. We have a few psychologists in this sample. Sociology, anthropology, paleoanthropology. And then we have athletes. We're behind on the athlete part of the study, so it's still kind of really preliminary. We only have about 21. And also notice, by the way, and this is something that I'm going to want to try to change as best we can, is we an imbalance of women. Okay, the one we have the most, but even then it's only 1 out of 5 is the art. The science is only 7%. I mean, these were professional athletes. We actually do have, we haven't coded her yet, though. We have a couple of tennis players, female tennis players. But basically, these are all male, historically male sports. Although basketball now has the WNBA. But baseball, basketball, football, golf, tennis, soccer, swimming, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's our sample. Here's just gives you a sense of when these people were born. The majority of them were born in the first 20 years of the 1900s from our sample. Okay, a few people all the way back to the 1870s. But they were old. They had to live till 1950 or so. Anyway, and then a few people. There were a few born in the 70s, but not many. But the majority of our sample were born in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. So here are we didn't do all 200 disorders. That would be crazy, no pun intended. But you know, to code that many disorders. But here are the ones we chose, and these are the major disorders. You know. Alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, bipolar, anxiety disorder, OCD, schizophrenia, autism, suicide. Most of these are in the 1% range, though, if you look at the general population, except depression. Anyone have any idea what the general population rate for depression, we're talking about clinical depression, is? It's pretty high. 20%? Nope. It's about half that. It's about 10%. That means 10% of us are diagnosed. It's by far the biggest disorder, or the most common, I should say. Anxiety disorders are too, but depression is one of the, and alcoholism. Actually, alcoholism is a little higher. That's the only one that is higher than depression. Kleptomania, you know what that is? Stealing, having to steal things. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, gambling, various. Synesthesia. Do any of you know what synesthesia is? What is synesthesia? Right, exactly. Good. So it's when your senses, some people have cross-wiring of their sensory modalities. So when they let's say they see a color, it might stimulate the smell system. Or they might see numbers as colors. Like 7 might be yellow for some people, or blue, or days of the week. So that's synesthesia. And it's really an interesting, technically it's kind of a disorder, but it's not completely dysfunctional, but we classify it. It's classified as a disorder, sleep disorder, eating disorders, and so on and so forth. Okay, so those are what our students rated these on. And then I'm not going to go into too much detail. Don't worry about that. Iterator reliability is just a standard thing. Obviously, that you can't just say someone's rating something and they're really doing it. You have to train them and make sure they're actually rating the way different people would see the same thing. So it has to be reliable, consistent. So we had to get 0.8 reliability between our raters. And then they were rating these pretty simply as either each disorder was either absent, probable, or present. Okay, so you're reading all these paragraphs and then you're making a decision. Okay, was there any sign of alcoholism? Was there any sign of depression? Nope. Then you put zeros. If maybe, you put a 1, and if it's pretty clear, you put a 2. Okay, pretty straightforward. So here's then the main finding that we have right now. Not too different from Ludwig's findings. So our outcome here is lifetime. So this is having at least one mental disorder at any time. And notice, and so what I've done here is I've simplified things into just 3 categories: artist, scientist, and then our comparison group of athletes, as well as the comparison group of the general population of 46%. And notice that here, 86% of the artists, and this is all the artists, including actors and writers and musicians, and it's not just the poets, 86% of them have at least one mental disorder. That's, you know. But then notice that the scientists are also a little bit elevated. They're 61%. But here's something that's interesting. So these are not creative people, but they're really famous. They're eminent. They're athletes, but they're about the same. So what is it per se? Is it creativity, or is it maybe notoriety and fame that might elevate disorders? We don't, you know, that's an interesting question. But right now, if that's the base rate, at least for, it seems like it may not be creativity per se. It may be artistic creativity. Okay. And then just to show you what the most common, and this is true in the general population too, but the most common disorders in our sample, okay, depression. Look at this. Something like 56% of the artists, writers, musicians, poets, actors, more than half of them in our sample of 80 had depression. That's a lot. That's, you know, again, what I said earlier, the base rate in the population for depression is about 10%. So the base rate is down here. And notice, by the way, that the athletes are right at the base rate, about 10%. But the artists are at over 50%. But look at this. The scientists also are well above average. 40% of these creative scientists also suffer from depression. Anxiety disorders. Okay, again, clearly the artists are much higher than the base rate, and the base rate for anxiety disorders is something like 5% in the population overall. And so here it's 30% for the artist, and it's about 18, 16, 17%, something like that for the scientist. And it's a little bit elevated in the athletes, but not a whole lot. Alcoholism. Yeah, a lot of the artists are having trouble with alcohol, much more so than the scientists, and even the athletes are slightly more in that case. And then drug abuse. Again, artists are elevated, scientists are not. And then here's one area where it's pretty clear that the athletes are doing more drugs than the scientists, apparently, which is not completely surprising, I guess. And then OCD, obsessive compulsive. I put that up there partly because one of my hunches is that one of the more common disorders in science might be OCD. And OCD can actually be adaptive as long as it's not too severe, because it's all about, you know, being systematic and orderly and organized, and in science that kind of can be helpful. But as it turns out, notice actually that there were no athletes with that. Those are zeros, so they don't show up. So they literally there's only 21 of them, remember, so it's preliminary. But no athletes had OCD, attempted or committed suicide, or have autism. But for the artist, it's about 6%. For the scientists, it's about 4%. Suicide. This was a little surprising. Notice that even though you know, suicide is you know, people do in fact commit suicide who have different kinds of disorders, but depression is one of the main ones. That if someone is in fact depressed, that's the most likely disorder that's going to lead to suicide. But it's not, you know, schizophrenia does too. But notice that the scientists are a little bit more likely to commit suicide than the artist, even though they're not as depressed, which is kind of. And by the way, suicide, the rate of suicide is only about 1%, 1.5% in the general population. So it does seem like for some reason we have an elevated rate of suicide, both in the artist but surprisingly in the scientist, interestingly. And then autism spectrum. Asperger's, high-functioning autism, by the way, what we're really talking about here. But it's not too high. Okay. So what's the general conclusion here? Like we saw with Ludwig, it does appear that there is a connection between I'm going to use that word in quotes and take it in quotes because of course I don't mean it literally, but it's historical context. Madness, or some kind of mental disorder, as we would say now, there is a connection apparently between art, world-class creative art, and mental illness, and different kinds of mental illness. More so compared to the scientists and the athletes. And it does seem to be that the major disorders that these creative artists do suffer are depression, number one, anxiety disorders, drug abuse, and alcoholism compared to the scientists and the athletes. Okay, so it's not just all classes. Notice, by the way, schizophrenia doesn't show up. Schizophrenia is a really powerful and ultimately kind of destructive cognitive disorder. Where people are hallucinating, hearing voices, and so on. If you're actually schizophrenic, it's hard to even, it's hard to do things. You might have really creative ideas, but the schizophrenia tends to be so potentially debilitating that it interferes with creative expression of your ideas. But if you compare scientists to the other famous group, it does look like that scientists don't come out of this scot-free. They do suffer depression, interestingly, more than the comparison group of the creative athletes. Excuse me, not creative athletes, but just the athletes. Okay, so I want to ask you. I always like to ask your own speculations. And by the way, we're still trying to figure this out ourselves, so it's not like there's right or wrong answers. So think about this for a second. So the finding is fairly clear that it seems to be the creative arts in which some kind of disorder, especially the mood disorders, tends to be higher than average, and not so much in the sciences, and then even less so in sports. Although some disorders like drug abuse and alcoholism in sports do tend to show up. But what do you think this is? What explanation?
You have to use the
Oh yeah, we have a.
Did you compare fame to post fame? Because I feel like,
right,
especially with the athletes with drug abuse, depressions, because they've made a lot of money, they're famous,
very
now
good
they're
point.
not.
Very good point.
And artists.
So you're asking a really important question, which is, what's cause and effect?
Yeah,
here?
it's more.
When does this happen? Is the mental illness a result of their fame?
Yeah,
or
that's the biggest thing.
yeah. And what you're suggesting is that, especially in, like, let's say, athletes and so on, they're probably mentally okay, but then in the process of being world famous, they get access to these bunch of money and so on. Right. And I think that's probably true. The simple answer is we haven't analyzed that. Okay. And I've actually thought about it, and but that takes a different analysis. You have to go in and then say, when did these first signs happen in their life? But I am thinking about that. And secondly, but I would say that the artist, probably not so much. The artist might, in fact, from what I can say, from what I know about this in general, is that artists seem to be having these difficulties prior to their world-class creative art very often. And also, again, notice that with athletes, even it's mainly drugs, and it's not like anxiety disorders or depression or a result of that. Mainly the access to money and fame and so on, that you can buy things with you. Someone else had. Yeah. Can we get? Oh, you got.
Yeah. I was gonna say that for creative artists, it's a better expressive outlet for such certain disorders, say, to let them manage and understand the outer life and their life themselves.
Okay, so an artist, about a writer or a musician, or what are they doing? What's driving their creativity?
Expression.
Expression of what?
Of their feelings.
Of their feelings. They're trying to make sense of
what's happening.
Their own internal, and a lot of times it may be something traumatic or dramatic or difficult that they're trying to deal with internally, and they're using their art as a way of kind of trying to,
portray it or let
right.
other people understand.
Right. I mean, you think about the essence of poetry, for instance, other kinds of art, or music even, it's something that you feel and that you want to get out, whereas in the sciences, it's usually not completely that. But okay, yeah, that's. Anyone else?
Is this why dramas are the only movies that win Oscars? Because action and comedy, no one cares about, and you said earlier that it's your perception, so social people, it's society's perception
right.
that creates fame.
Right.
And so is that what we hold
yeah.
in high
No,
regard?
I actually have no right. I think that's a good observation. That there's certain, we see this in science and we see in art, that it's not just the quality per se that gets awarded, it's the content. There are certain topics and questions and genres that are more likely to get awards simply because they're really good, or even journalism. You think about what wins a Pulitzer Prize, it's usually some socially important topic that also happens to be well done. But if you do something well done and it's a topic that people just don't, it's just not going to be as awarded as much. So I think you're right. I think that dramas are more likely to be awarded by the Academy than, let's say, comedies, simply because it's appreciated, it's meaningful to more people in that way, right? So it meets that criteria. Yeah.
Hi. I agree with what you were saying about the musicians, like Johnny Cash, for instance. Like how he felt inside.
Right.
He showed that to people, but he also was bad on drugs and stuff like that. But that helped him cope with what happened.
Yeah, you think about the association between music and creativity. That a lot of these musicians, the reason they're on drugs.
Right. Exactly.
There's a reason they're on drugs.
They're like eternally.
Because they're self-medicating.
Right. Exactly.
They're trying to deal with all the anxiety and depression that they're feeling.
And they want to like look up to par and be up to par with.
And yet, but see, there's tons of people who are depressed and anxious and on drugs, who aren't creative.
Exactly.
Too. So it's a certain class of people who then can do something with that inner turmoil and express it in a creative outlet, whether it's music or painting or poetry or, right. Yeah.
May I ask 2 questions?
Sure.
Well, first I was wondering, I forgot if it was on the list or not, but did you include like narcissism as part of?
Yeah, that's a personality disorder, and it was included. Right?
Oh, it was included?
Yeah.
I would expect that to be kind of high in athletes.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting you say that too, because in my dissertation research, I actually studied really creative, eminent scientists.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't narcissism, but it was arrogance and self-confidence and hostility that showed up among the most creative scientists. People had to be kind of really hyper-confident to succeed. Science is a very, very, we're talking about, you know, kind of like really competitive academic science. To be at that level, you have to be really, really good. And you have to be really confident. And you have to be convinced that what you're contributing is better than what other people are doing. So there is a little bit of narcissism involved in that. And I think you're right. My hunch is that these people probably, as a group, it just didn't show up in biographies, but I think as a group, they probably are a little bit high on narcissism. Because they really are talented, but the world does kind of revolve around them.
Well, they need that to have that drive to continue.
Right.
You can't be thinking you're the second best. And, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Second
my second question is, have you guys thought of possibly a better way to conduct a study like this for the fact that sometimes certain things might not come out in biographies where...
Yeah, there's all kinds. I mean, you know, one of the things you learn doing research is there's never a perfect study, and there's never a perfect methodology. So every methodology you use has limitations. And yeah, you're right. There's no doubt that, I mean, ideally, I would have liked to have gotten 2 or 3 biographies on everyone, because each biographer is going to be a little bit different. And there are some people, like Jobs has a few biographies written about him, and they're all going to portray a slightly different thing. But it's hard enough to get one biography. And so if you limited it to 2 or 3, you would really cut down your sample and make it less representative. So every decision you make, right, this is only one approach. This is just the, I would actually also like to, follow up. I would like to do a longitudinal study with people who are really creative young people and follow them up to answer the question that you were bringing up a minute ago, which is the mental disorder a cause or an effect of their fame and notoriety? So there's other approaches to this. But the problem with that is that it's really hard to follow people up for 30 years, you know?
Thank you.
Okay. Yep.
Mine's not really a question, it's just like an observation to like everything, but I've been in band and like drama and everything since I was in 3rd grade, and I actually went to, it's a school downtown, it's a fine arts college, Columbia College downtown, and it's just strictly fine arts. And a lot of people that I talk to, this really backs it up. Like I can't speak on like celebrity terms, sorry, but a lot of people that I did know that were involved in the arts did have like problems with anxiety, depression, and how they explained it to me when like if they would ever come out with it, they would tell me that it was their way of making people feel the opposite of how they felt. So if they were depressed, especially the actors that I knew that were acting in like comedy, they wanted to make people feel the opposite of how they did. Or the musicians, like I've been a musician, and a lot of people that I knew wanted people listening to feel the opposite of how they felt writing something.
There's a couple of things. First of all, we're in Chicago. I love the blues. And the blues, the best definition of the blues is having fun with your blues. A good blues musician you're gonna feel great, even though it's really about very depressing kinds of things. So you're taking that depression and you're making it fun. Right, and so that's the second thing I was going to say about that. And for those of you in personality, Freud had an explanation for this as a defense mechanism. And have you gotten to Freud yet? What defense mechanism Are we? Instructors can't answer. Yeah, what defense mechanism is this? Right. So Freud talked about it. That sublimation is when you take this, these thoughts and ideas that are really threatening and kind of dysfunctional, but you're making something constructive, socially constructive out of it. Mm-hmm. Right. And that was his explanation for creativity. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. My son, by the way, goes to Oakland School for the Arts. He's 14 years old. He's been in theater forever, and he really wants to be an actor. And yeah, and I've already started to see some interesting psychology in these little guys who are really talented. They're really talented already in all kinds of areas of art. Mm-hmm. But yeah, they're not your typical kids.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had a question about like the athlete part of it.
Yeah.
Like how can you said multiple times that or like because athletes can be original and can be.
Yeah. Okay. Here's the thing though. Right. And I think you can make that argument. Yeah. But they're not typically athletes. Even they have to create something both original and meaningful. So where would the originality be? Talent is not necessarily original in a sense. I mean, it's not creating a new.
I mean, athletes do create do perform world-class athletes perform new skills or new moves within a game.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, and I've thought about that very issue. It's just but an athlete like a Michael Jordan, for instance, or now my favorite, because I'm from Oakland, Steph Curry, is doing things that people have never done before. It's true. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So on some basic level, that is creative. But if their career, you probably wouldn't necessarily, except for maybe a few exceptions like that. I mean, there might be I might be willing to argue that there are a few exceptions, but the vast majority of athletes, even who have biographies written about them, aren't people who fundamentally changed the game. They were just really good. Okay, so to be even in the creativity question, you would have to fundamentally change the game. And you could argue that Steph Curry is changing the game, or that Michael Jordan changed the game, or that somehow Tiger Woods, for instance, changed the game, or something like that. But the vast majority of athletes, I think it's fair to say, didn't fundamentally change the game. And they're also executing skills, and it's usually the coaches. If you want to argue creativity in sports, you might argue for the coach level, the people making the new plans and strategies, like in football and basketball and so on. That might be where the creativity comes in. But the athletes are then just executing those plans. Yeah.
Hi, I just had a quick question about the data on the disorders.
Uh-huh.
I believe it was, I forget what the percentage was a very low percentage of people in the study subjects were women.
Yes.
And so how do you, I know that there's like a 2-to-1 ratio with mood and things like that, so how, if that number is so high,
right.
What do you make of that?
Right, that's an interesting point too, because what you're pointing at is like depression, for instance, and other mood disorders. There is a gender imbalance in those, so women are actually more likely to suffer the mood disorders. Men are more likely to suffer personality disorders and schizophrenia. Right, so that suggests that these might even be deflated if we really got more women in our sample, which ultimately we're trying to do, and we will do. Well, I don't know if it'll ever be 50-50. So that might even be an underestimate at this point. That's an interesting observation. Yeah.
So what do you make? What do you make? I mean, do you guys think that that's something then that the number is that much more robust, that it's that much more powerful?
Probably.
Okay.
Yep. Good question. Oh.
What are your thoughts on the correlation between creativity and psychedelic drugs?
Yeah. Frank Barron, my mentor and as I said earlier, intellectual hero, and we wrote that paper together. He was one of the first back in the 60s. He was at Berkeley in the 60s. He was a creativity researcher actually in the 50s, and he was one of the first to do some research on psychedelics and creativity. The interesting thing about psychedelics, especially the hallucinogens, is that they do change perception, and that's what makes them hallucinogens. And again, it's kind of like disorder in general. Some people can do something creative with those, and some people can't or don't. So just because you take a drug doesn't automatically make you more creative, but it might. The originality part is easier. The meaningful part is harder. You can see things and think things that are really original and different, but it might be word salad. So it takes a special person then to do something really also meaningful with those different perceptions. Yeah, but that's and then there's the mood enhancing drugs that people take. But yeah, that goes back a long ways too. Yeah.
Going back to that chart also, the data on the scientists with committing suicide.
Yeah.
Do you have a breakdown of like psychologists or psychiatrists? Because don't they have the highest rate?
Yeah, out of the scientists. Yeah, you know what? I was thinking about that too. I was thinking, were these scientists who actually? Well, actually, some of them were technologists. Like, for instance, I can say that the movie was just made about the computer genius who solved the problem in World War II. Why am I blanking on his name? Yeah, Turing. Thank you. He committed suicide. So that was one, and there's a couple of others. What I can say is that the psychologists in our sample, I don't think any of them committed suicide. Yeah, for better or for worse. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this kind of goes back to what you just said, but this is kind of a statement. I think for like the scientists, why there's such a high suicide rate, is it possibly because they're dealing with chemicals? Because I read an article and it was like the highest suicide per profession, and I remember pharmacist was way up there, and I was thinking about it, and I'm just like, well, not a lot of people want to jump off a cliff because they're scared, but people don't mind taking 20 Xanaxes because you don't really have to. There's no like fear with that. So
right. That's an interesting point. Yeah. I still would have thought that the arts would have had higher rates of suicide, but yeah, that we haven't gotten to yet. But that's an interesting speculation. Yeah.
Have you looked into the?
Going back to the chart where it had the higher depression and stuff, and when you were saying I was going into it, I kept thinking about it, and with the artist, since we have more of an open outlet, but when you kind of go deeper into the mind, whatever we see, I feel like we see reverse. I did dance for 10 years, I did ballet in Point, I do poetry, and for me, what I see something as chaotic, and I can turn it into order.
Right.
So depending on where we're at, we're taking chaos into order or vice versa, and then putting it out differently. And it's not always just our emotions of how we want to convey. It's also something depending on our living situation or who we were influenced by.
I think that's a very important point. So what he was saying is that you can take that as an artist, you can see disorder and chaos and want to express it in your own meaningful, organized, ordered way. That's the meaning that you have that you then express. The other point I was going to make is that I think actually that what happens in science too, to some extent, is if you have some kind of mental disorder early in life in science, you're going to be self-selected out of the profession. Because in order to do science, you need to be pretty reliably there and so on and so forth. So let's say you're suffering from a mood disorder or schizophrenia or something and you're 22 years old and you have maybe all kinds of creative talent. In science, you're not going to have much of a profession, unfortunately, because it requires too much time. And whereas if you're a poet or a writer, you can take 6 months off, 9 months off, have whatever issues you're going through, and then go back into it. Whereas in science, you can't really do that.
Do you think isolation is part of the key factor of that, between depression and setting-wise? Because with depression, you kind of feel like you're alone. And so while being isolated, you're alone in your own thoughts, which could also contribute with scientists and suicide rate, because they're on so much pressure trying to figure stuff out.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's hard to know about suicide and ultimately when that happens and why, and loneliness could be part of it. But also, we know that creative people in general don't mind being alone. They actually even like being alone. They need to be alone sometimes. So for them, it's not as the room of one's own, that Virginia Woolf wrote about. Yeah.
Have you looked into the correlation of people being born earlier in the century to later, with their diagnosis of being more prevalent later in the century because of more diagnosis and just like how biographers would?
The simple answer is we haven't looked at that. But what I can say is that, for instance, rates of depression have gone up a lot in 100 years. So it used to be like 1 or 2%. Now it's like 10%. And so that's changed. But yeah, so we haven't looked at that.
One more question. Yeah. Would you consider Howard Stern a creative genius?
There's a few things I want to say. My simple answer is no.
He's a good interviewer.
Actually, but what I was really going to say, though, to be more professional about it, is I just don't know enough about him. I only know him superficially. So I don't listen to him, and I don't really know. I mean, I think he's, from what I understand, I mean, he's clearly, you know, has a voice and is speaking a lot of people's minds and so on. Anyway, but so I personally, I wouldn't put him in the creative category. I put him in the entertainment category. And they're not quite the same thing. Yeah.
Dr. Feist, one mental disorder that like, I wasn't listening, or maybe it wasn't on the slide, was bipolar disorder, and I wonder. You got a lot of musicians that have suffered from bipolar disorder. People that I've known that I've played music with have had bipolar disorder. They tend to write songs, all the time, but they hit creative streaks. So,
yeah, you know, this is so far we haven't found too much in our sample. We haven't found too much bipolar, which I'm surprised by because there's actually been a lot of other researchers who have found. Actually, if you're really interested in this topic, there's a great book called Touched with Fire, written by a psychiatrist called Kay Redfield Jamison back in the 90s. And she analyzed the relationship between bipolar and creativity. And her basic finding, by the way, was that there's definitely an association, but it tends to be the hypomanic. It's not the full-blown mania. It's kind of milder forms of like cyclothymia, which is a slightly subclinical form of it. Because again, like Simonton was saying, if you're full-blown with these disorders, it's going to be so dysfunctioning, or as it were, whereas a little bit of it can be enough that where you can then function and be. But yeah, the manic part is yeah. I would expect that to be there with the artist more than it is in my sample anyway.
It's energetic.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Functional.
Actually, because for instance, Virginia Woolf wrote this great. She was probably bipolar, and she wrote a lot about how her ideas just all of a sudden became really, really fast and flighty, and that she would start. And I've actually known, I have a relative who was manic depressive. And when she started talking about it, she was just high as a kite. And she would just start having all these ideas, and she would want to write, and she wasn't normally a writer, but it's not uncommon for people who are manic to want to express it in either writing or music or something. Now, how meaningful it ends up being is a different question, but they are having all these ideas, which is ultimately what creative people have too. So a little bit of mania is good, a little bit.
Other questions?
I think this young man has a question.
Do you believe people suffering with psychopathy have any potential in mind? Because I know some places in Europe, if you are diagnosed with psychopathy, it's grounds to just be institutionalized.
So just to be clear, you're talking about psychopaths. Yeah. Yeah, I've actually studied them completely separate from the creativity question. And I think what you have with psychopaths is you have different, the true psychopath, the one who can plan out and in very planful way, they're destructive. I don't think there's really much evidence for them being creative. And I mean, they can be clever, but in general, they're not necessarily really partly, if nothing else, let me just put it this way, by my definition, the meaningfulness, although you can say, well, they're so clever in their destructiveness that they've created, they're really, really clever criminals, for sure, and really smart ones. Is that creativity? I don't know. Okay, I didn't catch the last part of your comment. Oh, lacking empathy. Oh, yeah. Right. And we do see that in creative people in general. Is that there's sometimes, especially in the creative scientists, there is a little bit lacking in social skills, lacking in empathy that you sometimes see in psychopaths. But that's really, but the psychopaths are really extreme. I mean, they hurt people and kill people even, and feel no connection and remorse whatsoever. That's a little bit more than just being a little bit awkward. Yeah. Okay. Well, it looks like.
Are there any other questions anybody has for Dr. Feist?
Actually, this is the funnest part of it. I mean, I like all these. A lot of good comments, a lot of good questions, a lot of good observations. At least one more way over in the peanut gallery. Okay.
Do you think depression went up from like the 1 or 2% to like 10 because people actually go to a doctor now and get diagnosed?
Yeah, that's $64,000 question. Why autism too? The rate of autism has gone up a lot. So the question is always, is it going up because the rate is really going up, or is it because it's just being diagnosed more? And a lot of times I think has a lot to do with the diagnosis being more well known and good, and sometimes even overdiagnosed. But I think depression is probably not being overdiagnosed. But but yeah, so I think, but then the question is, then that raises a more difficult question. Why is a higher percentage of our population depressed than they were 100 years ago? And I don't think we really have a complete answer to that.
More stress, perhaps, in today's life.
Yeah. Some people have argued that with technology taking over so much of our lives, and that we're not really working with our hands as much, and we're getting more and more bored, and depression ultimately can come from that. So some people are arguing that it has to do with this more modern, technologically advanced, or that actually is leading to higher rates of depression. But that's, we don't know that for sure, but that's a speculation.
Okay. Any other questions?
With technology taking over working not only in a pharmacy but a hospital setting, it's completely understandable because you have so many deadlines to meet and you have to keep them in time order. So if I work the chain that I work in, and I'm at my regular store, and somebody comes in, they just get out of the hospital, and they have 3 narcos and whatever else. And they're like, "Can you get this done for me?" And I said, "I have to keep in time order." And so you're stressed to get
So the stress and anxiety, yeah. So yeah, that's a whole different question. Why are we moving toward depression? But it probably has to do with the high level of stress that we're under. And yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate the time and questions and attention. And
Dr. Feist, thank you. Thank you for coming on campus. And on behalf of the Psychology Department and Moraine Valley Community College, we'd like to offer you this gift to say thank you for coming on campus. And,